Be still, and know that I am God. 4 words, more than almost any other verse in Scripture, have become shorthand for a very particular kind of comfort. They show up on candles, on wall art, in the caption under a photo of someone finally taking a breath after a hard week. And it makes sense why. The words themselves sound like an invitation to exhale, to let your shoulders drop, to stop spinning in your own head for a moment. Plenty of people have found real, genuine peace repeating this verse in exactly that way, and there is nothing wrong with that comfort. But open the actual psalm this line comes from and read what surrounds it, and a very different scene comes into focus. Mountains falling into the sea, nations raging, kingdoms collapsing. And right before this famous command, God is described doing something specific and violent, breaking bows, shattering spears, setting chariots on fire. Which leaves an honest question worth asking. If this command was first spoken into a scene like that, what was "be still" actually telling someone to stop doing? To answer that, we have to understand who was singing this psalm and what kind of room they were standing in when they sang it. Psalm 46 carries a superscription attributing it to the sons of Korah, a family of Levites who served as musicians in Israel's temple worship, generation after generation. This is not a psalm written for private reading in a quiet corner. It is a piece of liturgy composed for a trained choir, performed in front of a gathered congregation, almost certainly inside the temple in Jerusalem itself. Every we and our running through this psalm is not the voice of one anxious individual. It is the voice of an entire assembled nation, singing together, in public, out loud. This psalm belongs to a recognizable family of psalms scholars often call the Songs of Zion, a small group that also includes Psalms 48, 76, and 87, all built around the same central conviction, that Jerusalem, God's chosen dwelling place, stands secure no matter what surrounds it. These are not quiet meditations. They are bold, public declarations, meant to be sung loudly by a whole community, often in moments when that community had real reason to be afraid. Jerusalem, across the centuries this kind of psalm would have been used, rarely had the luxury of feeling safe. Judah sat in a narrow, exposed strip of land, caught between larger, hungrier empires, Assyria to the northeast, Egypt to the southwest, and later, Babylon rising to eclipse them both. More than once in Israel's history, a foreign army stood outside Jerusalem's walls, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Scholars have long connected psalms like this one with the Assyrian crisis under King Hezekiah, when the armies of Sennacherib swept through Judah's fortified towns and camped outside Jerusalem itself, close enough that the city could likely see their fires at night. Whole cities in the region had already fallen to sieges like that one. Whole nations had already disappeared from the map. Whether this specific psalm was composed in direct response to that specific siege is something scholars continue to debate, but the kind of danger it describes was not an abstraction to the people singing it. It was a memory, or a live possibility, for almost every generation that used this psalm in worship. This is the world the congregation singing Psalm 46 actually lived inside, not a metaphorical, spiritualized kind of danger. Armies, sieges, the very real possibility that the city they were standing in, the temple they were standing inside of, might not exist by the same time next year. So when this psalm opens by naming God as our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble, it is not offering comfort for a bad day. It is offering comfort for exactly this: the trouble of nations moving against you, war approaching your gates, an enemy that could, in purely human terms, actually win. And when the psalm turns immediately to language of the earth giving way, mountains falling into the heart of the sea, waters roaring and foaming, it is giving voice to that fear in the largest, most cosmic terms available. Not because the poets were exaggerating for dramatic effect, but because that is genuinely how national catastrophe on this scale would have felt, the whole world seeming to come apart at once. It is into this trembling, endangered, terrified world that the psalm's central turn happens. Not a shift toward personal tranquility, A shift toward what God actually does to nations who rage, to kingdoms who totter, to armies who march toward a city they intend to destroy. Which means before we can understand what "be still" was actually commanding, we need to look closely at exactly what God is described doing in the verses that lead directly into it. The answer is not hiding in a later chapter or in some other book of the Bible. It is sitting in plain sight, one verse before the words everyone already knows by heart. Before verse 10 ever arrives, the psalm issues a different invitation entirely. "Come, behold the works of the Lord," it says, "how he has brought desolations on the earth." Notice the verb, behold, come and see. Whoever is singing this psalm is being asked to look at something that has already happened, a completed action, not a hope, not a wish, not a prayer, still waiting to be answered. And what they are being asked to look at is specific. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. 3 verbs, 3 weapons, 1 outcome. Bows, the standard ranged weapon of ancient warfare, broken. Spears, close combat weapons, shattered. Chariots, the most expensive, most feared piece of military technology available in that period, something close to the ancient equivalent of an armored vehicle, burned down to nothing. It is easy to read "he makes wars cease" as a vague, general statement of peace, the kind of soft phrase that could mean almost anything. But the psalm does not leave it vague. It gets specific, almost forensically specific, about exactly how this cessation happens. Not through negotiation, not through a treaty, through God personally, physically disarming the parties involved, weapons broken beyond repair, nothing left for anyone to pick back up and use again. Which means the peace this psalm describes is not first pictured as an internal feeling. It is pictured as an external, visible, physical event, an army stripped, completely and permanently, of its ability to fight. And it is directly out of this scene, weapons broken, chariots still smoking, that the next verse speaks. "Be still, and know that I am God." In Hebrew, the word behind "be still" is harpu, and it is worth slowing down on this word specifically, because the English translation has smoothed over something the original carries far more sharply. Harpu comes from a root, rapha, that shows up elsewhere in the Old Testament, meaning to slacken, to let sink down, to let something drop. It is the kind of word used for hands growing weak and falling to one's sides, or for a grip loosening on something being held. This is not the ordinary Hebrew vocabulary for rest, the kind of word tied to Sabbath quiet or peaceful repose. It is a word suited to commanding an action, the cessation of something a person is actively, physically doing. Picture a soldier, mid-battle, still gripping a weapon out of pure instinct even after the fighting has effectively ended around him, the kind of person who needs to be told, directly, "Stop, let it go, your hand can open now." That is closer to the texture of this word than someone being invited to lie back and relax. There is a grammatical detail worth adding here too. The command is plural in Hebrew, addressed to you all, not to a single person. Given that this psalm has spent its previous verses addressing nations and kingdoms directly, the nations rage, the kingdoms totter, a command spoken in the plural, immediately after describing weapons broken across multiple armies, most naturally reads as continuing to address those same collective national actors. Not one worried individual sitting alone with a racing heart, combatants, plural, still standing amid the wreckage of a war God has just ended by force. So the command is not, "Relax your mind." It is closer to "Let your weapons fall." It's over. Stop. The verse does not end with the command to be still. It continues immediately. "I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." Read this half of the verse alongside the first half, and the whole shape of the sentence becomes unmistakable. This is not a private assurance whispered to one anxious heart. It is a public claim made specifically among the nations, in exactly the same arena where those nations had just been raging, warring, and finally disarmed. God is not simply asking combatants to stop fighting. God is declaring that his own exaltation, his own recognized supremacy, will happen in the very space where their violence used to be. Think of it like a ruler stepping into the wreckage left behind after a rebellion has been crushed, and declaring, in that same wreckage, in front of the very people who had been fighting, that this ground now belongs to a different order entirely. Not privately, in a throne room somewhere far away. Publicly, on the battlefield itself, where everyone who had raised a weapon can see it happen. This is where the popular use of the verse and its original use come into their sharpest contrast. Not a wrong use. Comfort for an anxious individual is a real, legitimate application of trusting God's power, and Christians across centuries have leaned on this verse in exactly that way, often for good reason. But it was not the first use. The first use was cosmic and political, a declaration that the God who had just ended a war between nations intended to be recognized, exalted, acknowledged as sovereign in the very theater where that war had been fought. There is one more detail in this psalm worth noticing before moving further, because it quietly reinforces everything the "be still" command is doing. A few verses earlier, the psalm describes a river whose streams make glad the city of God, even though Jerusalem itself had no major river running through it. Scholars generally read this as intentional imagery rather than literal geography, a picture of God's own peaceful, life-giving presence contrasted deliberately against the roaring, chaotic waters of the raging nations described just a few lines before. Chaos on one side of the poem, a quiet river on the other, and the command to be still sits right at the hinge between them, the exact moment the roaring stops and the river becomes audible again. Which raises a question worth carrying forward. If "be still" was first a command for combatants to drop their weapons because God had already won the fight, what does it actually mean to apply a verse like that to something as personal, as small-scale, as one worried heart on an ordinary day? If you just felt that word land differently, let your hands drop instead of relax and breathe. You are already hearing this verse closer to the way its first listeners likely heard it. That is not a small shift, and it is exactly the kind of discovery this channel is built around. If close reading like this is what brings you here, subscribing means the next one finds you, because there is still a thread worth pulling. This is not the only place in the Old Testament where God tells his people to stand still and let him fight instead. There is an earlier moment, centuries before this psalm was ever composed, where Israel stood trapped with an army closing in from behind and the sea closing in ahead, and heard almost this exact instruction. If Psalm 46 is echoing something older, something already familiar to the people singing it, that connection changes how deliberately this whole psalm was built. Go back centuries before this psalm was ever sung, to a much older scene of a nation with no way forward and no way back. Israel stands trapped at the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots are closing in. The same terrifying military technology this psalm will later describe God burning to ash. Ahead of them, water, no escape route, no possible plan a human commander could draw up, and the people, understandably, panic, turning on Moses, accusing him of leading them into the wilderness only to die there. Moses answers them with a specific, structured instruction. "Fear not," he tells them, "stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Notice the shape of this instruction, because it is not a vague call to feel calmer. It is a very particular pairing. Stop trying to solve this yourselves, because God is about to act on your behalf. The people are told to stand still, not because standing still feels peaceful, but because their own striving, their own fighting, their own frantic problem-solving is no longer the relevant factor. Something else is about to happen that their effort has no part in. Now hold that pattern in mind and return to Psalm 46. The Hebrew word Moses uses for "be silent" here, takarishun, is not identical to harpu, the word in Psalm 46. This is worth being honest about. The two words are related in theme, not in exact vocabulary, drawn from different roots entirely. But the structural pattern connecting the two scenes is unmistakable and textually verifiable. In both passages, God's people are commanded to cease their own action, specifically because God's own decisive intervention has already begun, or is about to begin. In Exodus, the sea has not parted yet when Moses gives the command. The people are told to stand down before they see the result. In Psalm 46, the order is reversed. Verse 9 already shows the weapons broken, the chariots burned, and only then, after the outcome, comes the command to be still. Put the two scenes side by side, and a shared theological grammar starts to become visible. Both are moments of overwhelming, humanly unwinnable crisis. A trapped nation with an army behind them, a raging world with nations warring on every side. Both involve a command to cease striving, addressed to a plural you, to an entire people, rather than one isolated individual. And in both, the cessation is not presented as resignation or defeat, it is presented as confidence, the appropriate response of people who have realized that the outcome no longer depends on their own effort, because God has already stepped in to secure it. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes what kind of word stillness actually is across these related texts. Whether the psalmist had the Exodus scene specifically in mind while composing Psalm 46 remains something scholars cannot prove with certainty. The vocabulary differs, and direct literary dependence cannot be established from wording alone, but the shared pattern, cease your own striving because God's action has made your striving unnecessary, sits at the center of both passages, regardless of whether one is directly quoting the other. Which means, be still belongs to a recognizable, repeated biblical shape, not passivity for its own sake, and not simply an emotional instruction to relax, but the specific posture appropriate to a people who have watched, or are about to watch, God do something they could never do for themselves. At the Red Sea, that meant standing on the shore while water that should have drowned them became a walking path instead. In Psalm 46, that means letting weapons fall from hands that no longer need them, because the war has already been decided by someone else. This is the deepest layer underneath the verse most people know only as a phrase for personal calm. Be still was never primarily about achieving inner quiet through willpower or breathing exercises. In its own biblical family, going back generations before this psalm was composed, it was the command given to people standing at the edge of an impossible situation, told to stop reaching for solutions their own hands could never provide, because the God who commanded their stillness had already, or was already about to, do what they could not. A city with its back against the wall. A choir singing anyway. Mountains falling into the sea, in the poem. Armies at the gate, in real life. The sons of Korah did not write this song in a peaceful season. They wrote it the way people write anything true, in the middle of the danger, not after it. Come, behold, the psalm says. Look at what he has already done. Bows, broken. Spears, shattered. Chariots, the most terrifying machines their world had ever built, burned down to nothing, in front of everyone. And only then, only after the weapons are already lying useless in the dirt, does the voice arrive that everyone thinks they already know. Be still. Not lie back. Not exhale. Let go. Harpu. The grip loosening. The hand finally opening. The soldiers still braced for a fight that is already over. I will be exalted among the nations, the voice continues, not in a private room, not in one quiet heart, on the very ground where the war was fought. Centuries earlier, another crowd heard almost the same instruction, standing in a different kind of impossible. Sea ahead, chariots behind, no plan a human hand could draw. The Lord will fight for you, Moses told them. You have only to be silent. Not the same word, the same shape. Stand down, not because it is peaceful to stand down, because it is no longer your fight. Two moments, centuries apart, one question sitting underneath both of them, unchanged. What happens to human hands when they finally understand they were never the ones holding the outcome? At the sea, the hands opened, and the water became a road. At Zion, the hands opened, and the weapons fell into the dust. Be still was never the sound of a person finding calm on their own. It was the sound of a grip releasing, because someone else had already closed his hand around the war. Most of us have never stood at the edge of a sea with an army behind us. Most of us have never watched a chariot burn. But most of us know what it feels like to still be gripping something long after the fight has already been decided. A conversation replayed for the 100th time, still being fought in your head, though it ended weeks ago. A diagnosis you are still trying to outplan, out-research, outthink, as if enough effort could out-argue what is already true. A relationship you keep rehearsing your case for, long after there is no one left to argue it to. A future you are still trying to force into shape with your bare hands, gripping so tightly you have stopped noticing your knuckles have gone white. That is not weakness. That is what people do when they have been taught their whole lives that holding on is what strength looks like. That letting go means the danger wins. The nations at Jerusalem's gates were not being told their fear was foolish. Israel at the sea was not being told their panic was sinful. They were standing in front of something genuinely too large for their own hands to solve. That part was real, both times, and the text never pretends otherwise. What they were not told was to fight harder. They were told something stranger, something that only makes sense once you notice who is speaking. Let go, not because it is safe to, because it has already been handled by hands stronger than yours. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from believing the outcome depends on you, on your vigilance, your planning, your ability to see every danger coming before it arrives. It is a heavy way to live, and most people who live that way do not call it fear, they call it responsibility. Be still was never spoken to someone who had nothing at stake. It was spoken to people who had everything at stake, and whose grip had gone white from trying to hold it all together. And it was not an invitation to stop caring, it was an invitation to notice whose hand had already closed around what they were afraid of losing. Maybe that is the part of this old song that reaches furthest into an ordinary week, not permission to stop caring about what frightens you. Something quieter than that. A question, really, aimed at whatever you are still holding so tightly your hand has forgotten what it felt like to be open. What would it look like to let your grip loosen? Not because the danger is not real, but because it was never actually yours to hold alone. Be still was never the sound of a battle ending, it was the sound of a hand finally opening. If this is the first time you have heard that verse, the way its first singers did, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to the Scripture Project so studies like this keep finding you. Share it with someone still gripping something too heavy to carry alone. And if a line here stayed with you, leave it in the comments. This is a community built on one honest conversation at a time.